Greetings and salutations, loyal viewers of this channel. My name is Sean, and today we are going to talk about one of the absolute worst pieces of crime denialism, and of course, it comes from Lance of the Serfs. And what's great about this video is that my video is going to be incredibly long, incredibly thorough, incredibly detailed, but the dose of Lance that you're going to get, that little bit of poison, is only going to be 60 seconds, because Lance put out a short to debunk the increase in crime, and we're going to laugh at each and every point made in the short, because Lance is an utter buffoon, and he's trying to obfuscate reality by showing you wrong, out of context numbers, and he's recording his screen with his phone in the hopes that you won't notice how delusional he actually is. But before we get into that, I just want to thank everybody who signed up over at actualjusticewarrior.com/join. There is no sponsor for this video. This one is for you guys. It's for the love, it's for the passion. Let's get into it.
Are you currently terrified of crime? Well, great news. In the next 60 seconds, I'm going to debunk all of this stuff so you can feel super safe.
So Lance claims that if you're concerned about crime, don't you worry, he's gonna debunk all the things that you think are going wrong in this country. And by this country, he means the United States of America. Lance is Canadian, he has no skin in the game. He's just doing this because he wants to deny crime, because the realities of crime make him incredibly uncomfortable, and they undermine his agenda.
Well, it is true during the coronavirus pandemic between 2019 and 2020, there was a rise in U.S. homicide rates by about 30%. But since that time, overall violent crime has declined by 1%.
So I don't even need to point out, or at least I shouldn't need to point out for anybody who's not Lance, because Lance probably doesn't know this, he's probably that much of a failure, that what he just said doesn't make any sense. So first and foremost, what he's talking about is not between 2019 and 2020. Yes, we're going to get this petty. It is the year-over-year increase from 2019 to 2020. So there were a certain amount of murders in 2019, then there were 30% more murders in 2020. More on that in a little bit. Then he says, don't worry about it, because since then, violent crime is down 1%. Well, first of all, violent crime and homicides aren't the same thing. Homicide fits into the category of violent crime, but that doesn't really help us with anything. But one of the things that Lance doesn't address, because he is a crime denier, and this is a crime denial tactic, is that 30% year-over-year increase in homicides is the largest increase in homicides in American history, in recorded history of crime. Here is a chart, and you know what's amazing about this chart? The only other year-over-year increase that's even close is 2001, and yes, that does include the nearly 3,000 people that were murdered in just one day on September 11th. So, the increase from 2019 to 2020, the year-over-year increase, was worse statistically than 9/11 in terms of homicides, where 3,000 people, again, were killed in just one day. So, a 1% decline in homicides post that is still a slight decline after a dramatic increase. Just because you establish a new baseline does not mean everything's a-okay, fine and dandy, no need to worry about it. So this doesn't make any sense. On top of that, there was an increase in violent crime. It was not as substantial as the homicide increase year over year. You can see in 2019, we're at 380.8 violent offenses per 100,000 people. And in 2020, we got up near 400 at 398.5. And then there was a slight decrease after that. This is the 1% decrease. However, this is largely due to the fact that certain burglaries, sexual assaults, and other crimes went down while the homicide rate was going up. So we're still at a very high point in terms of murders comparatively over the last decade. So just a quick note, this chart doesn't actually go to 2021, and the reason for that is that data for criminal justice comes out late, so this is provisional data, but the source, which is linked in the description, is the Brennan Center for Justice, which is a left-wing organization, and even they report a 5.2% increase in violent crime year over year from 2019 to 2020. So a 1% decline is from that new baseline, which again still means crime is elevated since the George Floyd riots.
But since that time, overall violent crime has declined by 1%.
So no, Lance, a 1% decline in violent crime in general year over year does not undo the new baseline, which is a 30% increase year over year, the greatest increase in American history, even when you incorporate 9/11 into those statistics. Obviously, this is ridiculous and absurd, but of course, it's coming from the Serfs, and his goal is to deny crime in this, deny reality, and that's how he can make such stupid points like that.
According to Pew Research, you can see that the amount of violent crimes that have been reported to the police and then solved by the police over the last decade have remained pretty stagnant.
Do we even need to talk about how stupid this is? And again, notice that Lance is using his phone to film his computer, trying to gloss over this information as fast as possible so you don't pause it and realize how insane he is. So what were we just talking about? We're talking about the year-over-year increase from 2019 to 2020, i.e. the key year being post-2020 and those statistics. This chart from Pew Research is before 2020. It ends at 2019. So what Lance is showing us is that before the crime spike, crime was pretty consistent. So before the big spike happened, there was not a big spike. Thank you, Lance, for this useless information. Thank you, Lance, for absolutely failing. Thank you, Lance, for being pathetic in every possible way.
What has increased dramatically is under an election cycle, the coverage first of Fox News, then other networks reporting crime.
So then Lance goes to this chart which says that crime is being reported a lot more in an election year, and that is obviously the big problem. Well, you have a bunch of politicians running explicitly on crime, so unsurprisingly, there would be segments being done on the issue of crime. A bunch of these segments, not likely the ones from Fox, are crime denial segments. If they were to run Lance's stupid video on MSNBC, this would be included in this statistic. Is that propagandizing about crime in the direction that Lance is concerned about? No. This is the crime propaganda that Lance absolutely loves to deal with. So yeah, it is not surprising when crime becomes an election issue that it is covered by the media that is covering the election. This shouldn't be confusing at all. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't debunk anything. Lance is trying to say, well, look at this chart before the crime spike. The crime was kind of like consistent. And then after the crime spike, when this became an election issue, years later, the media was covering the election issue. Crime debunked, subscribe to the Surf Time.
If you look at New York over the past little while, you can see this trend where the number of shootings has remained relatively constant. However, as we get close to January 2022, the amount of coverage in the media of the shootings skyrockets.
So first of all, notice the weasel words from Lance, who is in fact the biggest weasel on the internet. He says, this chart shows shootings being consistent for the last little while, but then the coverage spikes, and it spikes the most dramatically in January of 2022. Now, we will get into that in just a little bit, the January 2022 thing. Just keep that in your brain. But this chart does not show mild increases in shootings. So first of all, this chart is a month-to-month chart of shootings that goes back to 2019. And what's great about this month-to-month chart is you can actually see the dramatic spike in shootings is right around the time that George Floyd was killed and 7 new criminal justice reforms were passed at the state level in New York State. Bill de Blasio canceled the recruiting class. They were talking about defunding the police. They got rid of the anti-crime unit, which is a unit specifically designed to target illegal guns, and thus a dramatic spike in shootings and a new baseline. So shootings have not remained consistent. They went up at the exact point that is being highlighted by the media. And now we're talking about media coverage. And it's like, yeah, you're going to have more reports in the media when shootings spike to levels that we haven't seen in well over a decade or two. Shootings doubled post the Black Lives Matter riots in the city of New York. 2x. Do I need to explain that in chart form so that you can understand it? Here's a year-over-year chart. In fact, New York is now experiencing shootings at a level that we have not seen since the year 2006, and it's a dramatic increase year over year. Murders increased in the city of New York from 2019 to 2020 by 46%. In 2019, 319 people were murdered in the city of New York. In 2020, that number was 468. So 149 more people were murdered in the city of New York than were murdered in the year 2019. And you have to go all the way back to 2011 to find a year with a higher homicide count. Do you think that warrants some coverage in New York City? Do you think that deserves us to kind of pay attention to it? And the idea that in 2022, January of 2022, when we would get the numbers for the shootings in 2021, that there would be more news reports talking about it seems crazy to Lance, seems totally out of bounds, seems totally ridiculous, but it makes perfect sense when you're tracking a new trend, which is a giant increase, a doubling of shootings in the city of New York. On top of that, one of the reasons why you saw coverage of shootings or segments that mention shooting, which is what is actually being talked about in this Bloomberg article in January of 2022, is because we got a new mayor in January of 2022. And this mayor, Eric Adams, Democrat, ran in the Democratic primary on crime, and specifically, the one specific issue that he wanted to address was shootings. That was the issue that Adams ran on. So you have the statistics coming out right around this time that document the doubling in shootings. Then you have a guy being sworn in who was elected based on the doubling in shootings. So you're going to have some news coverage that might mention in January of 2022 the doubling in shootings.
And while scary property crime is something you probably hear a lot about, they never talk about how wage theft overwhelmingly dominates the amount of theft that takes place in the US.
So the last one is the stupidest whataboutism of all time, and this chart, by the way, comes from the Economic Policy Institute. Now, we've talked about the EPI multiple different times on this channel and how it's a left-wing institution. However, we don't just dismiss statistics because they come from the left. So first of all, it should be made clear that what we're seeing is actually not a side-by-side comparison of wage theft versus property theft. When you actually go to this chart, and by the way, I don't know if Lance found an updated version of this side-by-side that he's using. I'm going to guess that he didn't. I'm going to guess that he went with this one, which has a more dramatic difference. What you're comparing is property crime, so the value of property stolen by individuals in robberies, etc., versus wages recovered by government agencies due to suits related to wage theft. So you're already running into a problem when you're comparing property stolen from everyday people versus what is recovered for employees, what they got back. And what this says is that people are getting their property stolen, but at least there are mechanisms in place for wage theft recovery if your employer is screwing you over in terms of your wages. So that would be a good thing on its own. But again, this is because the Serfs is looking for the biggest disparity so that he can make this argument that we shouldn't care about one crime because this other crime is happening, even though he's comparing it to recoveries. But even if this were the case, it wouldn't be that much of a good argument because all you're saying is look over there when somebody's identifying a problem. Like somebody presents a problem, you say, oh, there's another problem over there, so don't worry about that problem. You can worry about both. Stealing wages, breaching contracts, and all of that is wrong, and also stealing from your everyday fellow Americans is also wrong. But we actually have updated numbers with the estimates of what is not being recovered versus what is stolen in property crimes that are a little bit more up to date. And I want to present them to you because Lance didn't bother to do that, and I want you to get a good picture of what we're talking about. So according to the EPI, and this is from early 2020, so it's before the crime wave, but much more accurate to the time period that we're talking about as compared to Lance's chart, which again compared recoveries to reported thefts. Wage theft is actually estimated to be around $15 billion. $15 billion a year in lost wages are stolen from employees. Now, the reason why there's a big disparity between 1 billion recovered versus 1 billion stolen is because not everybody sues right away, and all the reasons that you can understand. This is why you conduct a survey for certain things to get supplemental information to compare to the reporting data. However, burglaries and robberies are often also not reported, and this is because robberies and burglaries and property crimes have the lowest clearance rate from police departments. So if your stuff gets stolen, it's actually not that productive for you to report it to the police because chances are you're not going to recover your losses. And when you compare apples to apples in the survey data versus the survey data, is $12.7 billion in property crime theft. Now, that is still less, according to this left-wing organization, in terms of property crime losses versus wage theft losses, but as you can see, they're significantly closer than Lance's deceptive chart, which again compares what's recovered versus what is reported to have been lost in terms of regular property crimes, an apples to oranges comparison, but it's significantly closer. Now again, I am of the belief that both of these crimes are wrong, and that if you are caught doing them, you should be arrested and prosecuted and all of that. Lance is of the belief that these property crimes are totally fine because he thinks, oh, they're just poor Aladdins and oh, the wage theft and all that. Let them steal from all the stores so that way the stores can go out of business, so that way the people who work at those stores can't have their wages stolen because they're going to get fired because the store went out of of business. However, a keen observer would point out that we're still not really comparing two things that should be compared in the same light. Why don't we compare what is stolen from employers versus what is stolen from employees by employers? A bit of a apples to apples comparison. And unsurprisingly, the reason that the EPI doesn't do that, this left-wing organization, is because estimates of what is stolen from employers by employees in the United States are about $50 billion a year. So if we were going to put that on a chart, it would be the absolute biggest line. It would be bigger than the disparity between the apples to oranges comparison that Lance started out with. Lance's video is an excellent example of how it's so much easier to spread disinformation than it is to refute it, because Lance just throws out some quick drive-by citations of completely unrelated statistics, doesn't even quote the correct years, compares apples to oranges, and doesn't give you any context or anything that you can look up and check for yourself unless you're paying attention. And that's what he's counting on, his audience to not be paying attention to what he's doing. And I find it pretty funny that Lance has been hired over at the Young Turks, the great crime deniers of the internet, for a long period of time, at the same time that Anna Kasparian is becoming more and more realistic on crime. We talked about on this channel a couple of times how Anna is using what I say almost verbatim when she discusses the topic.
Now, what's incredibly frustrating is I keep hearing this talking point from the left about like, oh yeah, well the crime isn't as bad as it was in the 90s. Oh yeah. Really? Like, that's a terrible talking point. I know that there are some people out there who think, well, the prison system is not about rehabilitation. It's about taking people who pose a threat to public safety, taking them out of that environment and incapacitating them and punishing them.
While Lance is using all these rudimentary crime denial tactics because he doesn't want to acknowledge that the policies that he advocated for and still advocates for led to a dramatic spike in crime. Now, it's really hard to say whether or not Lance is being dishonest, because while he is one of the most weaselly, spineless creators on the platform, he's also incredibly unintelligent. He also makes stupid point after stupid point like this and ends up digging bigger and bigger holes for himself. So it's really hard for me to judge whether or not this is malice or stupidity. So I'll leave that question up to you guys out there in the audience. Anyway, that's all I really have for you guys today. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked the video, then show me by leaving a like, subscribe for more content, follow me on all my social media, support me via the support links in the description box of this video. This has been me taking down Lance Stupid Short. Till next time.